I 3D printed and painted Deadpool's brand new katanas from Deadpool and Wolverine, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through how I did it. The STL files for this sword can be found and purchased over on Wicked 3D's Patreon. The sword itself is included in their Weapons and Decorations Pack, Volume 1. So now that you know where the STL files can be found, let's jump into Orcaslicer and talk a little bit about how I scaled and printed them. So here we are in Orcaslicer with the sword loaded in at 100% scale. Now at first glance it may seem normal, but unfortunately I learned the hard way that this is actually incredibly small, baby-sized even.
This is Baby Knife. She's gonna fuck you in the face now.
Wicked 3D models are primarily made with the intention of resin printing, which explains why the default scaling was so small in order for it to fit onto most resin printers' build plates. But after some trial and a lot of error, I was able to come up with the correct scale, which seems to be the most accurate to what the actual prop would be. When it comes to the print settings, the only thing I want to highlight is that for the hilt, I printed this at a 25% infill density with a gyroid infill pattern. I wanted the hilt to be really strong and support the weight of the blade, and for the blades I did the opposite. I printed these at a very low infill density. I think I used 4%, also using a gyroid pattern, but I don't think it really mattered, and I just didn't want these to be too heavy and risk breaking or cracking along the connection points where they'll be welded together. As for orientation, I kept these pretty much exactly just like this, and they came out just fine. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get these printed. So now that the hilt and blade pieces are printed, it's time to fuse them together. To do this, I started by using a combination of super glue and Gorilla Glue to act as an initial hold. Once the glue dried, I used my soldering iron with an angled tip to weld the connection points together. I wanted the bond to be really strong, so I melted pretty deep into the plastic on both sides of the blade. Then, using an almost empty roll of filament, I used my soldering iron again to melt filament back into the holes to reinforce the weld, which also made it easier to sand smooth later on. When it comes to sanding and post-processing 3D prints, I'm of the belief that there is no be-all end-all way of doing it. There are a lot of techniques out there. All of them can get the job done, whether it's using sandable filler primer, glazing compounds, wood filler, or UV resin. At the end of the day, so long as you're doing something to cut down layer lines and imperfections, eventually you will get the results you're looking for. However, there is no substitute for hard work. No method of post-processing will be effective unless you're willing to put in some elbow grease in return. I experiment a lot with different methods, and those change depending on what it is I'm making. For the sake of this video, I'll be showing you a new method I've recently been using that so far has been working great for me. I gave the blade a quick pass through of sanding with 80 and 100 grit sandpaper. From there, I use an automotive high build primer made by U-Pull. It consists of the paint itself as well as a liquid hardener. You mix the two parts together using a 4:1 ratio, 4 parts paint to 1 part hardener. This product is very versatile. It can be applied using a spray gun, it can be applied using a paint roller, or you can simply just use a brush as you see me doing here. Now, you may be wondering, why? Why not just use a sandable filler primer straight from a spray can? Isn't it essentially the same thing? Well, not exactly. Typical store-bought cans of sandable filler primer have a much higher shrink rate, which means that naturally, over time, combined with excessive handling or wear and tear, layer lines and imperfections may start to reappear in the weeks and months that follow. This is something I've noticed myself personally with projects I've made in the past. I used to heavily rely more on filler primer and glazing compounds first, meaning that when I had a raw print, I was filling the layer lines using an excessive amount of these products instead of sanding the layer lines down first. And at the time, there were no visible layer lines or imperfections, but upon re-inspecting some of my past projects from months and years ago, I've noticed that some of them in certain areas, most notably the top dome area of helmets for example, had layer lines and imperfections when they previously didn't. Automotive high build primers such as the one you're seeing me use are really thick and have a much lower shrink rate, while at face face value, they are more expensive up front than the alternative. I would much rather not risk having my hard work of sanding come undone in the future, even if that means spending a little bit more money. But having said that, sprayable filler primers in a can absolutely still have a place in my process. I like to start with heavy coats of automotive primer, but after that, I still use glaze and compound as well as sprayable filler primer onward until I'm happy with the end result. Using a brush, I applied 2 thick coats of primer on each side of the blade. From there, it was just a repetitive process of sanding and spot filling imperfections, gradually using more and more finer grits of sandpaper until I was happy with the finish, repeating the same process with the sword hilt as well. It's time to start painting the sword, and there's a very specific way that I decided to go about painting it. I used a Krylon gloss black as a base coat, but rather than painting the entire sword first, I decided to paint the handle first on its own. The reason for that is because I wanted to wrap the handle with Paracord. Now, this is actually the second sword I made. The first one that I made off camera, I ran into some issues doing this because I painted the entire sword gloss black first, then when the paint dried, I attempted to wrap the handle, but just because of the way you have to maneuver the sword in order to wrap the handle, I was getting scratches and imperfections on the blade and all over the sword by doing that. So on the second sword, the one that you're seeing now, I decided to paint the handle first, that way I could wrap it immediately afterwards, and I ended up putting the sword in a vise, that way I could paint the blade evenly without having to have the surface of it touching anything, and I don't have to worry about the paint being damaged because the vise is making contact with the paracord, which protects it. When it comes to actually wrapping the handle, I'll be honest, I don't even know how to properly wrap a katana handle, but luckily the 3D model itself actually had an outline of the wrapping on it, so I used a little over 10 feet of this really thin paracord, and I did my best to just match the pattern that was on the model, and I used a CA cyanoacrylate super glue with an instant spray activator to keep the wrap nice and tight as I was doing it, that way it wouldn't come loose or undone as I was doing the entire handle. I also forgot to mention that before I wrapped the handle, I used a small brush and some airbrush gold paint to paint all of the little in-between gold details. It's a good thing I remembered to do this before I wrapped it, because had I waited until after, it would have been a nightmare. Now that the handle is wrapped and painted, it's time to paint the blade. So the first thing I did is mask off the handle, and I once again used a Krylon gloss black and painted the blade both sides, and I did about 2 to 3 coats. Now, you may not have noticed watching the film, but Deadpool's new swords have this really cool gold stripe on the top of the blade. I decided to paint that next because metallic gold spray paints have a really nice finish if you use a gloss black base coat underneath them. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of me masking off the gold stripe for the sword, just because of how long the blade is. There's not really a way for me to get that in camera. It would have just been a mess. But the way I figured it out is I kind of just looked at reference images of the sword and came up with a measurement that best matches what it would be, and I took that measurement and drew little dots with a Sharpie all along the blade, that way I had a straight edge for me to follow with my masking tape. Once everything was masked off, I painted the gold stripe with a Rust-Oleum metallic finish paint. I waited 24 hours for the gold to dry, then I used masking tape to mask off the gold that I had just painted, because now it's time to paint the lower half, the metallic finish. For the metallic finish, I used an Alclad Chrome. This is a lacquer-based paint that's made exclusively for airbrushes. They're pre-thinned and are ready to spray right out of the bottle. I had my compressor set to about 15 to 18 psi, and I did about 3 coats on both sides of the blade in order to get a finish that I was happy with. As for clear coating, when it comes to this paint, I think it's up to you whether or not you want to clear coat it. There is a clear coat that's made by Alclad themselves that's meant to go on top of it, and I've read posts that say that once you clear coat it with that specific clear coat, you can then go and take a 2K or whatever clear coat you want and then do it on top of that. Me personally, and my experience using this paint in the past, it is durable enough for me, and I know that I'm not going to be bringing these anywhere. These are just going to be displayed on my wall, so for me, clear coating was not necessary. And with that, the swords are now finished. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly, these were a lot of fun to make, and I hope you enjoyed and possibly learned something along the way. If you're interested in seeing more, please consider subscribing. I have many projects planned that I would love to share with you all in the near future, but until then, thank you, and I'll see you next time.